Wow, this is a great paper. Thank you, Mary Ellen. And I hope that mine will sort of follow from Mary Ellen's paper and kind of continue this thread of discussion about the importance of looking way past to understanding the present. We're all gathered here to really understand, I think, this unimaginable incarceration crisis that we're in today, but I think as importantly to talk about how to end it and lessons from the past and what to do and what not to do, and that's kind of the spirit that I brought to my talk today. Because in my view, and granted I'm biased because I am a historian, but it seems to me that we cannot fully understand how to end today's incarceration crisis without really understanding the history of it. Without understanding how we got here, we will have a hell of a time figuring out how to not do it again. And so I want to suggest that one of the ways that we can think about today's crisis is to recognize that, in fact, it is not the first, nor the first staggeringly racialized prison crisis that this nation has witnessed. And this really picks up on Mary Ellen's paper. We've been here once before, as she points out, in the wake of the Civil War, when African Americans were also imprisoned in unprecedented and staggering numbers, when prisons were also the site of serious inmate abuse as well as labor exploitation, and when human as well as civil rights of the incarcerated were also completely disregarded. By examining why the nation's first prison crisis came about, and I think also by taking note of the ways in which it ended, and I do think that particular moment does end. I mean, it doesn't become nirvana, but it does end and then become something else. I think we get a new perspective on the second crisis, today's crisis, and how it too might eventually be ended. As we all know, with the end of the Civil War comes the end of the institution of slavery. But with this possibility of African American opportunity, with freedom, with extraordinary African American hope for the future and for the possibilities of self-determination, also clearly came white panic and a white determination to keep control of the American economy and society by controlling newly freed African Americans every move. And one of the most important ways in which postbellum whites attempted to maintain control and thus to keep African Americans in a position of social and economic dependency, it turns out, was criminalizing black spaces, black actions, the actions of the poor, and ushering in, I would argue, the first age of racialized mass incarceration. And indeed, thanks to egregious manipulations of the law, criminalizing behaviors that were not criminalized before, etc., jails and prisons that had previously contained only whites came to be filled with African Americans. I think Mary Ellen gave some great statistics. You think about the state of Georgia, for example, after the war, or actually right before the war, there's not one African American in Georgia State Penitentiary. By 1871, however, 84% of the inmates in that institution were black, and by 1876, 90% were African American. So by the mid-1870s, a full-scale incarceration crisis, a deeply racialized crisis existed, and it was defined not just by the sheer numbers of inmates of color, but also by the extraordinary brutality of the nation's penal institutions, and also by the extreme exploitation of inmates for profit. To be sure, Southern whites' desire to maintain control of the region's newly freed black population clearly laid the groundwork for this first prison crisis, but notably it was their desire to rebuild the war-torn South on the cheap that ensured it as a long-term policy. Incarcerating African Americans, they quickly learned, was not only socially useful, but it was highly profitable. So notably, and I want to note that the first prison crisis did not just play out in the South in ways that I think historians are just beginning to see. It also plays out in the North. The North is also criminalizing the black community as well as forcing inmates to labor for private interests, and they also resort to barbaric tactics to meet production quotas. And so again, in ways I think we've not yet appreciated, after the Civil War, a national incarceration crisis raged across the United States, a deeply racialized crisis. And again, because of the extent to which African Americans were locked up, because of the brutality, a brutality that really was national, and because of the profit motive in incarceration, all but the most Pollyannish of contemporary observers would have been quite certain that this carceral crisis would never end. But at least in the form that it existed then, it did end. And I think the reasons for looking at that are important. At least legally, most of the most egregious forms of convict leasing had largely been eradicated by certainly the 30s, in many states by the mid-20s, and by the mid-30s, the labor exploitation of inmates was drastically reduced. It was on the wane. And as importantly, by the 30s, there was a glimmer of a measure of reform coming into penal institutions that would have just been unimaginable decades earlier. Now, to be sure, and I want to be clear about this, prisons were still horrendous institutions, and it would take a great deal more activism, particularly in the 60s and 70s, the period that I work on, to really tackle more fully the vestiges of abuse and exploitation left over from this first prison crisis. But nevertheless, the racialized prison crisis touched off by the post-Civil War white desire for control, I think, does abate. Now, critical to ending this first prison crisis, it seems to me, is a combination of three things. First, the fact that some Americans in the free world finally decide to take it upon themselves to expose what's really going on behind bars, and we hear a lot about that in the NAACP story. In other words, to educate the public about the human costs of this incarceration crisis. Second, that other Americans in the free world started to realize that mass incarceration also hurt them, that they had a stake in ending this crisis. And finally, third, that prisoners themselves began increasingly to speak out, to mobilize against the horrors of the nation's criminal justice system that this first incarceration crisis produced. The fact that convict leasing and the mass incarceration upon which it defended was brutal should not have been news to anyone, but far too many Americans, namely the nation's citizenry who was white, did not expend very much thought on the incarcerated or on the conditions that they endured. And that is until about the 1920s. And a number of things happen in the teens and in the 20s, I think, to bring some new attention to the prison system. And I don't want to overemphasize this for reasons that Mary Ellen's paper lays out, but I nevertheless think something is going on. Again, the attention coming to these stories from the NAACP, but also there's a really interesting case of a 22-year-old, a white 22-year-old from North Dakota, who ends up in a labor camp in Florida, who ends up brutally murdered. His parents are told he dies of malaria, but they don't rest with this. They investigate, and it turns out that their son had been beaten for 2 days straight. He was eventually murdered from this, and this leads to this huge state investigation and national headlines. And for the first time, people start to kind of say, what in the world is going on in the South? I mean, interestingly, that attention does not so much go north, at least now. But calling attention to the horrors of this first carceral crisis alone was insufficient. Necessary also was that other Americans who had virtually no direct connection to prisons, but started to recognize that they too actually suffered because of the labor exploitation that accompanied it. When they got active, that also mattered. For example, working class miners in places like Tennessee and Kentucky starting to realize that when companies could use prison labor, it directly hurt them economically, but not just Southern miners. Also in the North, I mean, workers across the nation and the early labor movement starts to recognize that this has a direct impact on their livelihood. And indeed, worker agitation, particularly during the Depression, was really effective in putting in place some serious laws to limit prison labor, and particularly by limiting the sale of prison goods across state lines. Again, though, as important as shining light on prisons were and bringing people's own self-interest into the equation, the activism of prisoners themselves was also crucial. Convict leases protested mass incarceration by doing everything from maiming themselves so that they could no longer net prison officials and private companies' profit, but they also rebelled in many more overt ways. And so by the 1930s, some of the worst aspects of the nation's first prison crisis were on the wane. Again, by no means perfect, but some of these things had at least been outlawed. And indeed, this discourse of rehabilitation begins to enter, the idea of bringing education into prison facilities and so forth. Now, again, this is going to take a long time to undo itself, particularly because throughout the rest of the 20th century, things are not perfect. In southern prison plantations, as some of the stories that Mary Ellen has told us, to urban jails like the Tombs in Manhattan, to rural maximum security facilities like Attica that I write about, there was still a great deal of work to do. But interestingly, that same cocktail of forces was instrumental in ushering in this period of activism and reform that would become the 1960s. That is, calling attention to the problem, educating the public to what was going on. A crucial thing happens in southern prison plantations when prison reformer Tom Merton goes to the Cummins Farm and Tucker Farms and writes this, graphic expose of what's going on there, which ultimately leads to that whole system going into receivership for the treatment of inmates, and lots of civil cases that come out of that. But again, it wasn't just the case that it was sort of muckraking and calling attention that made a difference. It was also about other people in the public without a direct and obvious stake in the incarcerated, recognizing that their interests were furthered by ending mass incarceration, or in this case, the brutalities going on in prisons. And so in this case, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it wasn't so much the labor movement, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but rather activists in the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, activists in other left-wing struggles who recognized that they had much to gain by working hard to end prison oppression. Realizing that working to end the oppression that flourished inside of prison walls clearly related to and aided efforts to end oppression outside of prison walls and vice versa. And indeed, thanks to the efforts of Black Power activists, white leftists, civil rights lawyers from a variety of ideological persuasions who all saw key links between what they were trying to accomplish in the community and what needed to change in the nation's penal institutions, some significant prisoner rights cases were filed in the 60s, cases that had a dramatic impact on the way in which prisons were run. And again, and I cannot stress this enough, equally important to bringing substantive change to prisons in the wake of this first prison crisis was the activism of prisoners themselves. From 1946, when prisoners in Boston are launching sit-down strikes, to 1951, when prisoners in Angola are engaging in mass slittings of heel tendons in protest of their labor conditions, to those who took over the Tombs in 1970, to those who brought Attica to its knees in 1971, prisoners mobilized mightily during the second half of the 20th century, to change the conditions under which they live. And I would say that this activism really mattered. Even at Attica, where the state of New York responded to inmate activism by massacring scores of people on September 13th, 1971, and subsequently torturing them for weeks, prisoner activism had mattered. In the wake of the Attica Rebellion, 85 prison reform bills were proposed to the New York State Legislature, and by the end of 1972, not only had many of these bills been signed into law, but $12 million of public funds had been earmarked to make sure that some of these reforms were implemented. And again, notably, there's much to talk about because clearly this doesn't stick, but one can clearly say that the moment of the 1960s and certainly the early 70s is a remarkable moment of change, of reform, not of crisis in the same way that it had been 50 years earlier. And even, it's interesting, you look at the public polling data, the general public's view of incarceration and the incarcerated in this period, it's really dramatic. The first polls done right after the massacre at Attica, only 10% of everyone polled thought it was a good idea to go into Attica with force. The vast majority of Americans polled maintained that, cooperation, guard training was needed. There needed to be more guards of color in the prisons. I mean, it was just a remarkable moment of public understanding and or sympathy of what was happening in the nation's penal institutions. Now, we all know, though, that despite this moment, somehow this nation ended up in another incarceration crisis, one that makes the first one I mentioned in some ways pale in comparison. And the question is, why? Well, here's where I'm taking about 20 pages of my paper out, and I'm going to, for the sake of time, and simplifying. here. But in short, just as it was the case back in the late 1860s and 1870s, when African Americans mobilized for greater rights in the free world and the rest of the nation, that whites turned to and slowly but surely laid the groundwork for the politics and policy of racialized mass incarceration, so did this phenomenon play out in the wake of the 50s, the 60s, and the early 70s. Just as whites with economic power and skin privilege to lose after the Civil War found their solution to their woes in the criminalization of black space back in 1865, so it appears they did so after 1975. Indeed, the prison crisis of today is just as dependent on the criminalization of black space as was the one of yesteryear. Without question, the most direct contributor to this phenomenon was the 1973 Rockefeller drug laws. But not just this, also this broader move to put far harsher penalties on both felonies and misdemeanors, and also to make, again, previously non-criminal offenses like spitting or loitering crime. This criminalizes urban spaces. It transforms African American neighborhoods from the mid-1970s onward. So just as it mattered back in 1876 when Mississippi's legislature passed a major crime bill, this is a quote, aimed directly at the Negro, redefining grand larceny, and arrests shot up dramatically, so it mattered when the District of Columbia passed D.C. Code 35251, which made it, quote, a criminal violation to consume food or drink in a Metro Rail facility. Recognizing the similarities between the nation's first prison crisis and its second not only gives us a much clearer sense of why the second crisis happened, but it also allows us to see, I think, a clearer path towards ending it once and for all. In fact, in addition to backlash, one of the reasons why I think that the second prison crisis happens at all is because the lessons learned about ending the first one get completely forgotten. As one might recall, one of the key reasons why the most egregious examples of convict leasing and the chain gang go away is because people in the free world start to see their own economic interests in this. And basically, the labor movement completely ignores what's going on in the prison system in the 60s and 70s. In fact, cuts it loose, does not care. And in fact, it really contributes to the rise of the carceral state by buying into this whole notion of black criminality. And it does this in a way with dire implications, not just for the rise of the prison industrial complex, but also for the white working class and the black working class alike. Essentially, bottom line, prison labor today is again causing a serious threat to the free world workforce and simultaneously is again costing inmates their safety and health on jobs that they often have no choice but to do. And not only did the labor movement fall down on the job in the 70s, doing its part to ensure a second prison crisis, but so did those in the earlier decades, so did those who in earlier decades had been vigilant about talking about what was happening in prisons. I mean, basically, people didn't care. No one was talking about it. There was a noticeable lack of reporting on prisons, lack of research on prisons. And while no one was watching and no one was paying attention, basically this whole system rolls back to the 1870s. But just, and this is, I want to kind of just end now, and I think a justifiably optimistic note. Just as Americans eventually worked hard to rescue their nations from the grips of a racialized incarceration crisis in the early 20th century, I think so we are now once again coming together to do so. And in fact, the same sorts of things that ended the first carceral crisis, things like connecting with allies in the free world labor movement, getting reformers to take an interest, taking on the system in the courts, and getting prisoners, supporting prisoners who act on their own behalf are finally beginning to happen again. Notably, both AFSCME and the UAW are finally turning attention to prisons and prison labor. Of course, once again, we're all here, journalists, scholars, and activists are spending a great deal of ink, time, and breath on the mass incarceration crisis. Scores of new books shining light on this, conferences such as the one we are there today, and of course lots of organizations. I'm a Soros Justice Fellow. The Open Society Institute is, the whole Criminal Justice Fund, and of course the Sentencing Project this new report that's just come out. I mean, I think the impact of this stuff is really, really important, and it is indicative of an earlier moment when this sort of stuff mattered. And perhaps most important is the fact that with such outside activism and with such attention, once again, being finally trained on penal institutions, we can see that inmates, the incarcerated themselves, finally have started to have a bit of a voice. I mean, for example, now that outsiders are training their attention on the horrors that take place behind bars, such as those that occur in supermax prisons, the inmates in such institutions are getting heard in really substantial cases. And it wasn't until Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International demanded access to these supermax facilities that organizations such as Stop Max could help initiate these lawsuits and so forth, and really begin a legal assault on these Orwellian institutions. And finally, again, back to inmate activism itself. Some remarkable cases I know we've all been watching in the news. I mean, everything from Garrison Johnson versus State of California, where this is the ruling against the segregation by race in housing within the prison, to the really significant case in 2000, the ruling in 2009, basically ordering California to release 50,000 prisoners. This kind of stuff is, again, a sign of what happens when these three legs of the stool are together. People from the outside who are not really connected with prisons recognizing they have a stake in this. Inmates themselves being able to be active on their own behalf. And, again, people calling attention to what is going on. And such victories, I mean, they can't happen in isolation. They have to happen in tandem. And I will just end by saying this. It seems to me, again, this is the history part of it. Should we succeed in ending the second prison crisis, we all must be keenly aware of the lessons that the past teaches us, and namely that without constant vigilance from citizens in the free world, without constantly struggling to keep the human and civil rights of the incarcerated protected, a racialized incarceration crisis can, once again, engulf this nation. History matters, and the only way we don't repeat its worst moments is to remember how we got out of them and what it takes to keep them at bay. Thank you.